Okay, so let's begin. So I think we were finishing off the Gemara on Nun Dalid Omid Base, and then we'll move on to different topics. So just to get us back to where we were, I wanted to go through um, to clarify the Tosas and the Ramban on Nun Dalid Omid Base. We started with it last week, but we didn't finish. So we've been discussing, maybe the central question, and that is the relationship between the mitzvah of Yibum and the Isra of Eshes Ach, and whether it's Hutra or Dechuya, by which we mean, is there a contest, clash between the prohibition to have any kind of relationship with a sister-in-law, the wife of your brother, and at the same time, when there's a death and there are no heirs to the brother, there's the mitzvah of Yibum, and that's what we've been discussing for the last two or 3 weeks. This is all throughout Masechet Yevamos, and we talked about Mu'beres, what happens if she's pregnant. We talked about multiple wives and multiple brothers. What about having a relationship after the Chalitza or after the Yibum, or from a brother and a co-wife that, were not the actors in resolving the Zika. So we've been discussing all those issues and whether it comes under the rubric of Aseh Dochalos Aseh Giesh Bakares or not, and why it isn't limited only to, one encounter, Bir Rishon, many issues, Abba Shol, and so on and so forth. So I want to finish off our discussion. We began this Gemara last time, but it's a very kind of eye-opening Gemara. So I want to go back and finish off with the, explanation of Tosas and the Ramban, just to show you how they are connected to their broader views. And then I want to talk about one other Ramban, and then we're going to talk about a different theme. Okay. So the Gemara here on Nun Daled Amud Beis, in the Mar Makomos, it should be on the on page 4, maybe. Everybody have that? It says Talmud Babli Yevamos Nun Daled Amud Beis. Yes. If not, if you have a Shas Gemara or Gemara, it's on Nun Daled Amud Beis, 54b. Everybody with me?
Yes, we got it.
Okay. This is what the Gemara says, a very remarkable Gemara. The Gemara says, Elanida diksiva gabe eshas ach lamali. What does this mean? So, as we noted, the Torah in 2 different places delineates the various arayos. Arayos meaning, illicit relationships. So the main one is in Parshas Achremos. Parshas Achremos, we have a list of all of the, ervas. In fact, on Yom Kippur, we've discussed this in the past. At Mincha on Yom Kippur, the choice for Kriyas HaTorah is the Arayos Parsha of Achremos. That's quite remarkable. The Rishonim already discussed why that is. I'm weighed in on my own suggestion, but okay. But there's a second Parsha of Arayos, and that's in Parshas Kedoshim, one Parsha later. Many years, as we know, we read Achremos and Kedoshim as, conjoined Parshios. Anyway, in Parshas Kedoshim, we have a very strange pasuk. And the pasuk reads as follows: B'ish asher yikach es eshes achiv. If a man were to have a relationship with the wife of his brother, nidahi, she is a nida. Ervas achiv gila aririmiyu. You have exposed the erva of your brother, right? And therefore aririmiyu, you're deserving of a severe punishment. Aririm is a kind of a kares. The details are not important for now. So what the Gemara is concerned about is why, in describing the Isra of Eshes Ach, why does the Torah use the expression nidahi? That's not what a nida is. A nida is a woman, who is ro'adam. She's a menstrual flow, and that has consequences. is
Well, there's only one reason, because it's temporary. Like
so
need is temporary, so maybe they're trying to emphasize that Asia Sach is not permanent. That's the only reason I could think of.
excellent. So very good. You're thinking in the right way. So, but what exactly would they have thought? So let's flesh it out. So why compare Eishes Hach to Nida? So the Gemara says, look at Rav Huna. The Amar Rav Huna, Remez liyavama min Torah minayin. So the Gemara gets a little stranger before it gets a little clearer. The Gemara says, where's there a hint to the principle of Yibum in the Torah? So the Gemara says, minayin. What do you mean? Where's there a hint of Yibum in the Torah? It's not a hint. It's explicit in Parshas Kitetse. There's a parsha that says, this is what we've been discussing all year, right? Ki yeshu achim yachdav, when brothers, live together. Umei sechad mehem, ubein ein lo, right? And then we have Yavamo Yavo Aleha, Lekachalo Leisha, and if not Chalitza. So that's in Parshas Kitetse in Devarim. That's not a remez, that's not a hint. And it's certainly not based on the pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim in Vayikra. So the Gemara says, yeah, you're right. Ella remez livama shasura b'chai bala minayin. What we really want to know is is that a reference that would establish clearly that a sister-in-law is off limits to her brother-in-law when the brother, meaning after divorce, when the husband, the brother, is still alive. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? You need a source to teach you that. Let's talk about a concrete case. Let's say Abraham married Sarah, right? And let's say Abraham has a brother called Ruvain. So you need us to tell you that if Abraham and Sarah divorced, that Ruvain would not be allowed to marry Sarah? That's obvious.
We actually have it the other way around. We need somebody to tell us that two sisters, for example, one sister dies, that you can marry the other sister. For that, we need
right, exactly.
Limud.
Right. That's a great point. So the Gemara says, "Hi Svarahi." This isn't a chiddush, right? It's obvious. Midomer Achmana la'achar misas bala shari, because the classic case of Yibum is a case of where the brother died, there are no children, and then there's Yibum. Mechlal de b'chaye bala, if the husband is still alive, why would anybody think that there's a heter to be involved with the brother-in-law? That the brother-in-law should be permitted, should be obligated, or at least commanded to step in to save the legacy of his deceased brother, her, former husband. Their marriage was cut short tragically by his death. That's one thing. But, for there to be a divorce and the brother-in-law just to be able to be involved with her after the divorce, just because there are no children, why would you think that? So the Gemara says, well, just because Yibum is only Lachar Misa, that doesn't mean that there isn't a heter, or at least a lighter Iser of Eishes Ach, even after divorce. After all, what you might say is, the Dilma La'achar Misas Bala, mitzvah. Maybe if he dies and there are no children, then it's a mitzvah. But B'chaye Bala, Rishus. As long as he's alive, even if it's after divorce, it's permissible for the brother-in-law and sister-in-law to marry. However, it's not a mitzvah if there are no children. It's not a mitzvah, it's a rishus. Inami, or if you want to say a little bit differently, says the Gemara, la'achar misas bala in, b'chaye bala lo. The principle is that when there's yibum, namely he dies, he doesn't leave an heir, then it's a mitzvah. If it's a divorce and there are no children, but he's still alive, then she is prohibited. But instead of being prohibited like she was previously, with the penalty of kares as an eshesach, maybe it's lav haba mechlal aseh. since we're deriving it from the fact that Yibum is an asay only after Misa, the implication is if there's no Misa, so it's an Isser asay, so it would be at least a lesser penalty or punishment. Therefore, but either way, the Gemara says, by this, make sure everybody knows this. I don't want everybody to walk away from the shir and turn into a posek and give the wrong psak. So the Gemara says, Amar Kra, therefore the Torah says exactly what Jacob, very good, Jacob, what you had in mind. The Isha Shor Yikachas Eishes Achiv Nidahi, the comparison of Eishes Ach to Nida is for the following idea. The Chi Eishes Achiv Nidahi, Ella Kinida. Ma nida afal pishiyesh laheter laachar mikan b'shasi sura b'kares afeshas ach nami afal pishiyesh laheter laachar mikan b'chaye bala kares. So good, Jacob was right. Basically, what the Gemara is saying is, you might have thought that just like in nida, no, I'm sorry. You might have thought that since there is a heter, a mitzvah of yibum la'achar misa, so even b'chayaha, as long as she's no longer connected fully with that man because it was a divorce, there would be already some impact, that part of the relationship is over. Kamash Milan, it's like nida. What we learned from nida is that even though things are going to change, she's going to become muteres. She'll go to the mikvah. She'll stop being ro'adam. She'll go to the mikvah. She'll become muteres. But as long as she is a nida, there's a chi of kares. So too, even though had the husband died, there would be a heter yibum, a mitzvah yibum. Nonetheless, as long as he's still alive, there is no yibum, and there's not only iser, but there is kares gamor. That's the Shakavatari, the Gemara. So when you think about it, this Gemara, again, let me make it clear. The conclusion of the Gemara is totally consistent with what we know. In the end of the reading of this text, what do we walk away from? The only heter to be involved with your brother's wife is if he dies childless and you fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum properly. Anything other than that is chayv kares. That's the maskana.
So do we want to say that if it's divorced and afterwards he dies, then it's okay?
No.
But that would be the logic if we follow this exactly the way we said it so far. That would be the conclusion we'd reach logically.
No. The Gemara's Havamina was even worse than that. The Gemara's Havamina was
even after we patched it all together,
we patched it all together.
The major difference is that
no.
in other words, in the lifetime of the guy,
No, because remember, in the end of the day, this is what's so strange about the Gemara here. It's very logical, even though it's still a chiddush, to say that, when you have a normal marriage and, the husband tragically dies, and he also, doesn't, leave an heir. So then the idea that the brother would step into that marriage, right, and to protect the wife and to provide for the ongoing legacy of his brother is reasonable. But once there was a divorce and the end of the marriage, meaning there wasn't a happy ending of the marriage, so what logic is there? There might be a heter, but there's no mitzvah for the brother-in-law to marry the divorced sister-in-law for the sake of the brother-in-law who divorced her.
Seems to be focused on the fact that he's still alive.
Forget about the fact that he's still alive. I thought you were asking me a minute ago what would happen if he.
That's my point. My point is the Gemara seems to say, okay, since he's still alive, can't do it. Okay.
No. What they're saying is since he did that, anything. The Gemara's conclusion is that anything other than his death in the middle of a marriage is not a basis, even without children, would not be a basis for yibum. And that is very reasonable because the idea of, kriyeshvu achem yaktav and the responsibility to the brother that is expressed by a relationship with his wife is something that only makes sense in an intact marriage after he dies. But if they were to be divorced and then he would die, then of course that would be irrelevant. So anyway, but before we get to that, so the Rishonim were trying to struggle to figure out this Havamina. What was the Havamina? One more time. The Gemara says, if not for the comparison between Eishes Ach and Nida, we would have thought that just as after his death there's a mitzvah of Yibum, that implies that, even while he's alive, after a get, there would be either no prohibition or a lesser prohibition if there were to be an attempt to unite the brother-in-law and the sister-in-law. And the question is, what is that based on? So Tosas here says something very amazing, and the Ramban says something amazing, and that's what I want to zero in on. The top Tosas on Nun Daled Amud Beis is Ela Remez Liyavama Shasura B'Chai Bala Minayin. Okay. So listen to what Tosa says. It's also on the sheets, again on page probably 4. Right after the Gemara, you have Tosas Masechet Yevamos Nun Daled Amud Beis, right, starting with Ela Remez Liyavama.
Given the Shari.
Okay, so the Tosa says as follows: the Kibbutz the Shari Rachmana Achar Misa. Since the Torah allows a relationship between this sister-in-law and brother-in-law after the husband dies, Ein Svara, if it wasn't for the pasuk, it wouldn't have been logical to think the Asira B'chaye Bala, that there's a total prohibition between this sister-in-law and brother-in-law even after a divorce, as long as the original husband is alive, even if it's after divorce. That wouldn't be logical. Why? The lo mistaber shayaba kosav lomar. If not for the word nida, we wouldn't have thought that the point of the Torah is to tell us that the only time that there's permission of a relationship is the asi ase v'dachi los ase sheish bakares. Ilav de muchakra behedja. Unless the Torah had a remez, befurash, right, which said, and the remez ends up being the word nida, we wouldn't have thought that the way that Yibum works is that there's a total prohibition during his lifetime, one that extends even after a get, but nonetheless, ase dochalos ase sheyesh bakares, when he dies and there's no children. Wow. So there are two things that you have to explain with Tosas. The first thing to explain is so what does Tosas think Yibum really is? The answer is it's exactly what he just described. What we wouldn't have thought would have been true if not for the word nida and this remez. Namely, how is Tosas understanding Yibum? Asay docha los asay sheyesh bakares. Is that consistent with Tosas's general view that that's what Yibum is? Yes. That's what Tosas says. Now, if you go back to Gimel Amud Beis for a minute, turn to Tosas on Gimel Amud Beis.
Problem is, it's not consistent with the way we treat Asay Dochalos Asay.
Right, but that's what Tosas already asked on Gimel Amud Beis. This is Tosas being totally consistent. Look on Gimel Amud Beis for a minute. This is how we began this topic. On Gimel Amud Beis, remember the Gemara said, look at the Gemara, 6 lines up from the bottom of the page. The Gemara says, Tamba the of Rachmana Aleha. Why do you need a source to teach you that if he was another Erva, let's say she wasn't just his sister-in-law, the wife of his brother, let's say she was also his daughter. Say his daughter married his brother, and then a brother died. So now she's not only the wife of his brother, she's also his daughter. So the Gemara says, the Torah says the word Aleha to teach you that in that circumstance, there's no Yibum. Yibum only overrides Eishasach, it doesn't override Bito. So the Gemara says, why do you need that source? Halavachi, even without that source, Habamina, Achos Isha miyabemes, my time, Damrina Asi Ase v'Dachalos Ase. Because what would be the reason to think that it would work? Because of the principle of Asi Ase, that Ase is Dochalos Ase. After all, Emer Damrina Asi Ase v'Dachalos Ase, Los Ase Greda. But Los Ase Sheish Bakaris Midachi. The Gemara says, but there's Karis here, it's his daughter or his wife's sister or his mother-in-law. Of course, there's no heter. That was the Gemara. So then Tosas jumps in and says, right? Bim tomar amai lo yofinon the lidchi miasei the yibum the dochi los asei the chorus the eshasach. Tosas says, what are you talking about? That's a very unusual case. But what about a regular case of yibum? Every case of yibum is yesh bakares. And yet we say asei dochalos asei.
No, but in Yibum we have a pasuk. Because there is a kosa that tells us you can
Right.
do it.
So this is what we
That
started.
overrides the fact
wait,
that
wait.
say is not dochalos.
Right. But does the Xeris HaKasuv teach you that it isn't asei dochalos asei, or does it teach you that this is an exception and here we override kares? The answer is Tosas thinks the second, and that's exactly what Tosas said on Dalet base. If you look on Dalet Aleph, that's what Tosas said. The
So it's only telling us that there's no chorus, but that you still can't just.
No, there is. He's saying it's techuya. This asay is docha even kares because if it wouldn't, there would be no institution of yibum. That's what the Re says. Omari de eishasach lamotzi lemelech bialma the lidchiase velos asay sheish bakars the shiny eishasach the mitzvaso bekach the efshar binyanacher lekai mitzvah yibum the imlokein bitalta mitzvah yibum. This is exactly what the first time Tosas discussed this question in the Masechta, Tosas already set the tone that what? The Yibum is based on Aseh Dochalos Aseh Sheish Bakares, but it can't be a paradigm for other Aseh Dochalos Aseh Sheish Bakareses because this one's unusual because it's institutional. But it's still based on Aseh Dochalos Aseh. Now, when you look at Nun Dalet, Omid Beis, that's what Tosas exactly described. Tosas says, we wouldn't have thought this.
What do you mean by institution?
I mean that there's an objective clash, not a coincidental clash between Yibum and Eshasach. Unlike Chayve Lavin.
But we know that Yibum is the only exception here to Aseh Dochalos Yesh Bakares.
According to Tosas, according to the Ramah and the Ramban, it's not an exception. It's just not midin Aseh Dochalos Aseh at all.
No, but I'm saying, but even according to Tosfos, it's not institutional. We need a pasuk.
No.
This is the only time you can do it.
No, we're saying because it's an institutional clash, meaning you can't have Yibum without Eshasach, therefore it's Docha even Kares.
But we may have other situations in the Torah where you can't have, which are institutional, but we don't say that.
Well, we might, and that might be the pshat. Tosas might think that that's the pshat in Karbonos and Shabbos. Right? We think it's Hutra, but Tosas might think it's Dechuya. The point I'm trying to make is that this is Tosas from the beginning of the Masechta all the way through. Tosas keeps pretty consistent the idea that the way the Yibum works is not radically different than Aseh Dochalos Aseh. It's just more Docha because you have no choice. If you don't Docha the Kares here, you'll never have Yibum. That's what I mean by the institutional clash. Meaning you imkain bitalta mitzvah yibum. But that now look back at Tosas, you'll see that's
exactly a lot easier for the Ramban and others who say it's Hutra to deal with this.
Right. So how are they going to deal with this Gemara? So we're going to see that in a minute. But go back to Tosas, you'll see now. That's exactly what Tosas said on Gimel Amud Beis.
Is there any criterion for distinguishing the mitzvos for which hutra is applied, and those with which hutra is not applied, but the chuya is applied?
So it's a great question. What I would say is that for the Ramban and the Yad Raman, for the Rambam, they think whenever there's an they probably think that whenever there's not a coincidental but an institutional clash, it's hutra. And Balitosis just don't accept that.
And meaning
if it's impossible to apply a whole institution of halacha, like let's say there's a korban musaf on Shabbos, right? It's every Shabbos. Every Shabbos also includes Isur Malacha. So the only way that those two things can both coexist, says probably the Ramban and the Ramah and others, is based on the principle of Hutra. The principle of Hutra means that not that there's an ongoing conflict between these things, but each one has its own space, meaning the Torah established that the circumstances determine not only a triage where one overrides the other, but the circumstances dictate whether we're dealing with one category or the other category. And it's not that it overrides, it's that the category of Easter doesn't apply under these. The Torah never said that you're not allowed to do malacha pertaining to a korban on Shabbos, to a korban musaf on Shabbos. And the Torah never said that you're not allowed to marry your brother's wife in a circumstance where there are no children, and there's a mitzvah of yibum.
Would the Ramban and the other poskim as far say that in coincidental clashes that it would be the chuyu?
No, and most of them go with the Ramban. The Rajba has some mixed evidence, but the Ritva, others, the Rama, the Rambam, I say, most of Chachmei Sfarad think Kutra. And I think to answer Rabbi Roth's
Even if it's coincidental.
What?
Even if it's a coincidental clash.
No, I would say when it's institutional, when it's.
What about when it's coincidental? By Valitosis will always be the chuyu. Right?
I think most people think that, put it this way, Rabbeinu Nissim Gaon, I wouldn't say nobody, Rab Nissim Gaon in Parak Rabbi Elazar Demila, in Masechet Shabbos Kuf Lamed Daled, seems to say that every aseh do kalos aseh is hutra, even the coincidental ones.
The Ramban holds that way also?
So I think we discussed this. The Ramban has this line about Ava being doches hayira. So I think he does hold that way. But as I indicated then, it's more like a triage. In other words, Yira is a more fundamental category than Ava. Ava is a more aspirational category than Yira. So the point is, if the question is, should you be a violator or a fulfiller, right? First, don't be a violator, then be a fulfiller. However, if you want to be a non-violator and a fulfiller, and you're just trying to, live in the imperfect world and maximize your avodas Hashem as much as you can, so then we say aseh do chalos aseh. We'll let you go since you're not trying to violate, it's a violation agav the mitzvah. So, but I think that works better with hutra, obviously. So I think the Ramban and the Rabbeinu Nissim Gaon are exceptions. I would say most Rishonim are of the opinion, to answer the Rabbi Roth's question, that whenever there's an institutional clash, it's hutra. And whenever it's a coincidental clash, it's dechuya. The Balitosis think even in institutional clashes, it's dechuya. And I think the Ramban and Rabbeinu Nissim Gaon will tell you that even many coincidental clashes are hutra. The Ramban doesn't think all are hutra. For example, the Ramban says, the Ramban says that, the Gemara says in Shabbos that Godol Kovod Abrios, the famous Gemara in Daf Yotes, Godol Kovod Abrios, the Doche Lo Saseh Min Torah. The Gemara says that, that's why if you're Lovesh Kilayim, they discuss whether you should be Poshet Afilu B'Shuk, So the Ramban in Torah Sa'adam, when he develops his theory about, Shabbos, Musaf Shabbos, and Yivamos, he says, yeah, but something like Godol Kovod Abrios, the Docha Lo Saseh Shabbatorah, that's Dechuya. So he doesn't think that everything is, that's not Midin Aseh Docha Lo Saseh. That's just, a special
Do you have any evidence of Rashi's opinion?
Rashi? There is some evidence of Rashi's opinion in Yibum. Let me say it this way. In terms of Yibum and Shabbos, the only thing we know from Rashi is that in his parish on Yisro is that he quotes the Mechilta, which is that B'dibur Echad Nemru. But as we discussed, saying B'dibur Echad Nemru doesn't prove anything. The Netziv in his parish on the Mechilta says that B'dibur Echad Nemru means Dechuya. And that's when he quotes Abba Shol. But I think more likely, Dibur Echad Nemru means Hutra. So I suspect Rashi thinks Hutra in his parish al Torah. However, Rashi in Yevamos, at one point, there's a very interesting Rashi, where Rashi says that Rashi's trying to explain why it is that, if you're Makadesh, a Yavama, like in the context of Zika. So Rashi says it doesn't do anything. Right. Rashi says, why doesn't it do anything? He says, because unless you do an act of actual yibum, you're going to encounter Eish Asach. So if you're Mekadesh, let's say, the Yivama, and then you try to, live with her on the basis of that kinyan, we'll get to it's called a mimer. We'll get back to it in a couple
That's
of
a
minutes.
drabonin.
For our psak purposes, it's drabanan. But the Rashi is trying to explain why is it drabanan. He says because she's an Eishes Ach, and you can't be Mekadesh an Eishes Ach. What do you mean she's an Eishes Ach? She's Omedes.
I
the
thought the Zika was a kedushin.
No, it's not a kiddushin. It's instead. Remember, I keep
Yeah,
pointing this out. A shomeres yavam is not whose mizana is not chayv misa. It's so it's kind of in lieu of that. But
I'm just surprised that Tosfos would not have taken on Rashi, which they seem to enjoy doing, even though it's a little bit strange.
So that Rashi that I'm talking about, I think it's on Nun Gimel Amud Aleph. That Rashi does seem to say that there is a concept of dechuya until you do a proper yibum. So the evidence in Rashi is
But then Rashi would say that Yibum is Futra.
In Perush al Torah, in Parshas Yisro, he says.
But even here, he's only saying if you don't do it, it's a dechuya. But if you do the Yibum properly, he was saying it's basically
maybe.
And just surprised that Tosfos doesn't take him on, which Tosfos enjoys doing whenever there's an opportunity.
That's true. Okay, so let's talk about the Ramban for a minute. Now, the Ramban could not read, but one more thing in Tosfos. So what was the Havamina that we rejected? Before we, if we didn't have the word Nida, what would you have thought? You would have, I just want to point this out because I think it's very interesting. You would have thought that if she was married and divorced, right? And there were no children, that she would be permissible to her brother-in-law, or at least it wouldn't be as severe an onesh. So I just want to point out for 1 minute, like why would it matter that there are no children? If the point is that there's a limitation on what are we really saying? That the Isra of Eishes Ach after Gerushin is moderated. That's what we would have said. We don't say this, but we would have said it. But what does that have to do with whether there are children or not? So if it was her children, that would be a different story. For example, let's say you have a woman who's a Bas Kohen. Her father's a Kohen. Then she goes and she marries a Yisrael. Happens all the time. So she loses her right to eat truma. It goes the other way too. If she's a Yisraelis and she marries a Kohen, then she eats truma. Correct? So, but the rule is, what happens if she gets divorced or the husband dies?
She can go back to her father's house.
She can go back to her father's house, meaning not literally, but she can eat truma as long as there are no children. Because if there are children, if she has children with this Yisrael, then that's a remnant of the relationship. And, you just can't turn back the clock anymore. But that's when she has a child. In our case, we're talking about whether he has a child. So why would it matter whether he has a child if it's not a child with her? If we're thinking that divorce, could change the
because she doesn't have a child also at this point.
And let's say she had a child from some other.
That would be a different story, but in the general.
But why do we care that he doesn't?
That's a low shlicha situation.
Right, but what I'm saying is, why does it care? Why do we care? Let's say he had a child, and she didn't have a child. It seems like she would be prohibited to the brother-in-law, even in the Havamina. But why? She doesn't have a child from this husband. Why do we care that he has a child?
Because all they
So I think the answer is as follows. Say again.
The whole thing is a hakim shame achev.
No. That's if it's yibum and the brother dies and there's no divorce.
Ju-
I'm trying to
just-
explain what the Gemara was thinking.
Just as a clarification, if this person
So
was
this is what I think. This is important.
married previously and had a child, and in
What?
this marriage he didn't have a child, is
The
this still
answer is because this is what I think the answer is. If he had a child, that's also a remnant of the relationship, because she forever is prohibited to that child as the stepmother.
But the Torah doesn't talk about a remnant of the relationship. The Torah talks about
We're not talking about the halacha. We're talking about what would have been if it was what would have been if not for the word nida.
No, what I'm saying, the Torah talks about zecher to the husband's memory, so to speak, existence, his legacy. Now, if he had a
No,
child,
but that's in the case of real yibum. We're not talking about that here. We're talking about the Gemara says that if not for the word nida, we would have thought that if a woman is married and her husband has no children and she gets divorced, that she might be permitted, or at least less prohibited, to her brother-in-law. And I'm asking the question, and Tosas is explaining why that would have been. But what I'm asking the question is, why does it matter whether her husband has children or not? If the point is that she's no longer married to him, and therefore she doesn't have a shame Eshes Ach anymore, why is that dependent on children? So if you wanted to say it was children that they shared, that at least I would understand, because you'd say, oh, they have a bond, that transcends their marriage because they're parents together, which is the example I gave you in Truma. However, if there is no such bond because they're not parents together, why do we care that he has it? Let's say he had a child from before he met her. Why does that matter? If we're just trying to figure out a way, we're just trying to figure out whether or not the divorce terminates the relationship even vis-a-vis the brother, and it's as if they weren't connected, or not. What is him having a child? As far as the brother is concerned, he's an uncle to that child, before and after. What does that have to do with why does that affect the status of the wife? But I think that the answer is as follows, and that is, as long as he, meaning the first husband, has a child, that too leaves an indelible imprint on the relationship of the wife, even after divorce, because she remains the stepmother of that child. So as long as there's a child, there's still a bond, even if it isn't her child with the husband. There's still she's still related, meaning you cannot completely negate the effects of that first marriage, of the marriage. And once that is true, then the shame, Eshes Ach, vis-a-vis the brother-in-law, even after the divorce, would be a problem, even according to the Gemara's original thinking. But once there are no children at all, and there's a divorce, so then the Gemara thought maybe if it wasn't for the word nida, we would have thought that the relationship has been completely obliterated, right? And therefore there should be either no obstruction or less of an obstruction for there to be the relationship with the brother-in-law.
we
Okay.
had aside for a second, just as a clarification.
Yeah.
If the husband had a child in a previous marriage, there would be no evil that he had no children in this marriage, right?
Correct. That's the point.
There would be no evil.
No yibum. Okay. So that's Tosas. Now let's look at the Ramban. So the Ramban can't interpret this the whole way, but the Ramban can't say, oh, the Gemara's problem was Dechuya is such a big chiddush, because he doesn't think it's Dechuya either way. So look at the Ramban. Ramban says, Hoda Amar Avuna. Remez liyavama b'chai balam nator minayin. This is in the Mar Makomos. Koshali. He says, I am having trouble with this. Hakol hoya b'chlal iser eshesach. Everything, is prohibited because of eshesach. Kishapir l'chal kos of eshesach shein lo banim lachar misas bala d'shari u'mitzvah or shar kol noshim kedekaimi kaimi. So I don't understand this whole discussion in the Gemara. You need the word nida to teach you It's obvious. Yibum is a chiddush. Anything less than the complete conditions of Yibum, namely the brother died without children, then there's Yibum. Anything less than that is Eishasach. So what's the Gemara talking about? Why would you have thought that Gerushin, that a get, would make a difference? Very strange. That's what Ramban asks. So the Ramban says, the ilo temahachi, lest you say, and I think this is what he's saying about, I think he's making reference to Tosas, lest you think that somehow if there's no child, so what we would say is that the divorce terminates, the completely terminates the relationship and the shame, Eishasach. If that's what you're thinking, he says, then why so he asks a very interesting question. This is question. If, let's say, the wife was an islandess, she wasn't capable of bearing children, right? So if the husband had died, there would be no yibum because she's not capable of bearing children. Right? So the Gemara wouldn't have thought that divorce would be good enough to permit her to the brother under those conditions. It's only thinking that it would permit somebody who, had he died, been a candidate for Yibum. But an islandess is not a candidate for Yibum. But if the whole point is, the divorce ends the relationship as long as there are no children, why wouldn't an islandess be included as well? Or, for example, another example that he gives, we have this rule, that if a brother is born after the death of the older brother, meaning Avram married Sarah, right? And then he died. And after he died, his brother, little baby brother Reuven, was born. So Reuven is not a candidate for Yibum, even if you wait him out, even if you wait 15 years, doesn't make a difference. That's called achiv shelo haya bolamo, right? He had to be alive when Avram was alive. If he wasn't alive when his brother was alive, they never, coexisted. Then he's not a Yibum candidate. So the Ramban says, why not? If Ramban says that's fine for Yibum, but why would that be a problem in the Gemara's Havamina? If there was a divorce, let's say Avram divorced Sarah, and after the divorce, little Reuven was born. And 20 years later, Reuven wants to marry Sarah. Meaning, okay, had it been a Yibum situation, he would have been disqualified, right? But if it has nothing to do with Yibum, it has to do with the termination of the relationship. So if it's about the termination of the relationship, what's the big deal? Why does it depend on the criterion of Yibum? That's Ramban's question. Says the Ramban, what you see from here is the Gemara's Havamina wasn't like Tosas understood it. What was it? Ikalameimar kishapir l'kol kasuv eishasach she'en labanim lachar misas bala de mitzvah goli she'en bechalal isur ela eishasach b'makom deleka sad yibum. Ramban says, if you understand Hutra properly, then you can understand what the Gemara was saying. They weren't saying, it's Dikuya. What they were saying is, listen, whenever there's Yibum, there's no Eishasach. So maybe we could take it one giant step further. And that is, whenever there could have been Yibum, whenever the objective circumstances of Yibum existed within the marriage, if the marriage ends, there's no Eishasach. Meaning, as long as let's say there wasn't a divorce. Let's say, Abraham and Sarah lived happily ever after. If Avram had died, there would have been Yibum. So then, if Avram chooses to divorce Sarah, since it was the kind of marriage that was omeid liyibum, maybe there's no full Eishasach. That's also Hutra. a marriage which is structured where Yibum is a possibility doesn't have the same level of Eishes Ach, because Eishes Ach isn't Nidche because of the Yibum. That's Dechuya. But for Ramban, that's not how Yibum works. How does Yibum work? Yibum has its place, and Eishes Ach has its place. Whenever there's a Yibum, so the halacha, the way it works is, if the husband dies and there's a Yibum potential, there's a Zika, so then Eishes Ach is already gone, even before, we don't know what he's going to do. He's going to do Yibum.
Well, we're not saying that there's a Zika in this case, just like
No, there's no Zika. But what we are saying is that structurally, whenever you have the pieces in place, which if he were to die before he divorced her, would have been Yibum, there's still no Eishes Ach. Says the Ramban, listen to the next line. Since had there not been a divorce, and instead there had been an early death, there would have been a Yibum. It's like a super hutra. The Havamina of the Gemara was that we say even
The
more
only
hutra
problem
than
with that is that in order for anything to happen in the Yibum case,
yeah,
which this sort of can't be stronger than the Yibum case, you need to do something, Yibum or Chalitza,
No, but the Yibum and the Chalitza for the Ramban are the resolution. Before you do it, there's still no Eishes Ach. The Zik alone says that there's no Eishes Ach, like the Rambam. Like
Yeah,
the Rambam.
but even according to Rambam, if he wanted to have a relationship with this woman, he
Yeah.
would have to do a Yibum. He couldn't do a Kiddushin.
Right, but as long as there's
But how do you correlate that to the divorce?
But unlike Tosus, who says that there's an Isra Eishes Ach every minute until he does the mitzvah, for the Rambam and the Ramban and the Ramah, there hasn't been Eishes Ach. You could wait 100 years and there's no Eishes Ach. It's true that you don't gain the kinyan until you do a proper yibum, and she's not muteris l'shuk until you do a chalitza.
You want to say from this that we would assume that in a divorce case that he could have a relationship with the sister-in-law?
The Gemara was saying that if the circumstances at the moment of the divorce,
Yeah, so
were
therefore he
such,
could have a relationship with the sister-in-law.
correct,
He could marry her.
yes, or that at least the onus would be
But
less.
don't we have some kind of a klal? Forgot what it was again, the wording, that what you learn out from something can't be stronger than what you learned it from?
Like dialogue and adin lios
Right.
kanad. No,
Okay.
but remember, this isn't the maskana. We're just trying to explain why you need the pasuk of
But
nida.
then the
Well,
Gemara doesn't have them in his.
it's not strong. Why is it
Because
a
there you
violation?
need something to break the bond before you can have a relationship. Either
No, but that's the point of the Ramban. You don't need that to eradicate the Eishes Ach. The Eishes Ach is gone the second that he dies.
but you see that in Yibum you do need something.
You
Either-
don't. All
either
you need is
the
to
act
create
of
the
Yibum
kinyan.
or the act of Chalitza.
Right. You need that for her to be muteres to him or to anybody else. But you don't need that to banish Eishes Ach.
But for example, if he wanted to marry her and say, come on, let's go to the rabbi, we're going to get 10 people together, we're going to make a chuppah kedushin. You can't do that. You have to have
It doesn't matter. So take this. First, I'm not sure about that, but because there's only a gerish in here, there's no misa, so it's just a different circumstance. There's no zika, there's no mitzvah, so maybe that
I'm
would be
talking about in the Yibum case, he couldn't do that.
right. But you don't have the impediment of yibum either. I mean, part of the reason that there's no kiddushin, in shomeres yavam is because there's a mitzvah of yibum. Here, there's no mitzvah of yibum. There's just a heter because there's no Eishes Ach. But the bigger point is that for the Ramban, the bigger point for this that for the Rambam and the Ramban and the Ramah, what banishes the Isser Eishes Ach is not the mitzvah of Yibum. It's the Misa and the potential of Yibum. So the Ramban's saying, I'll go one step further. In the Gemara, we don't paskin this way, and that is, if there's a divorce, and had there not been a divorce and he had died instead, there would have been a Yibum. There's no Eishes Ach in the divorce case either. And therefore, you don't have the onish of Eishes Ach. So then Ramban asks an interesting question. It says, V'im Tomar, Yesh labanim la'achar misas bala, lama li l'rbuya l'kamon. The Gemara says later on that, let's say she's pregnant, right, and gives birth, after the husband dies. So how did the Gemara? Well, the Gemara said, "How do you know that?" And the Gemara brings a pasuk. So the Ramban says, "How come you need a pasuk for that?" After all, the issue depends on whether or not the candidate is omedes liyibum or not, right? And there's no yibum if there's a child.
We don't know if it's child's gonna live.
1 second. No, okay. So then listen to the answer that he gives. This is so interesting. Hahilo kasha midi. De kol shma de ishus tzarich l'ribuya de la'achar misa. Kivin shenekar mimena osa shem. V'chein etzrichu ribuy la'eshas aviv u'la'kalaso b'perik dalad misos. Says the Ramban, no. The reason you need a ribuy is because the truth is this whole, Baruch Hashem, we know the halacha, right? We've been studying this, so we know the laws. But the laws are not obvious, meaning you could have thought that any marriage, the consequences of korva, of relatives of any marriage, would be terminated by death or by divorce, because she's no longer Eisha Sameis. But it's not true. But the fact that it's not true, the Torah needs to teach us each time. For example, says the Ramban, what about a stepmother? And what about a mother-in-law? And what about a daughter-in-law? You could have thought in all those cases, and then for each time you need psukim to teach you it isn't true, that even after a divorce, the prohibition, or even after death, the prohibitions continue. Meaning a man cannot have a, relationship with his father's wife, not his mother, his stepmother, or his mother-in-law, or his daughter-in-law, even after the divorce or the death of any of those, relatives. But in each case, you need to teach that, because you would have thought otherwise that the shame kalaso, or the shame chamiv, Eishes Aviv, these names, these categories, who says that they outlive, a divorce or a death? The answer is only the Torah can tell us that. So here too, you might have thought, that, maybe if a child is born after the divorce or after the death, maybe that's a different story. And therefore you need a psukim. But to continue one more line, and then we'll take the questions, but says, but that's not the same as aval ailanis v'saris leika behutzad yibum. If the only reason that the Gemara would have thought that a divorce would mitigate or maybe even permit this relationship, right, is because it's it could have ended up in yibum, and therefore it's a kind of hutra. That's not going to apply to somebody who's not a yibum candidate like Ailanis, or if he's a saris, he can't have children, meaning the husband, or Eishes Akav Shelo Yabolamo. Even dika din yibum gomer v'omer akmana lo yiyavim shmamen abi surah koish or mitchilasol anirislo v'chol aleh shem Eishes Ach kanal. Or if the Torah teaches us a chiddush that the only brother who's a candidate for yibum is one who coexisted with the deceased brother and at the same time, but if he was born after he died, meaning the younger brother was born after the older brother already died, that there's no possibility of yibum. If there's no possibility of yibum, then there wouldn't have been and then it would be obvious that there's a full it's ironic that there would be a full Eishes Ach, situation, because it's not omed litzad yibum. But for the Ramban, it turns out that this havamina, if not for the word nida, would have been an expansion of hutra. Not like Rashi, not like Tosas understands it, that what we're saying is, if there are children or there are no children, that determines whether or not you can, completely negate the relationship after a divorce. So two very different readings of this very fascinating Gemara on Nun Daled Amud Beis, one according to Tosas, one according to the Ramban, the far-reaching effect of, a mentality of hutra or a mentality of dechuya. Okay, if there are any questions, And then I want to make one more point, and then I want to move on to what we'll discuss next week, just as an introduction. Any questions?
See, if you answer questions, there are no questions. Let's try that one.
Wow.
The islandit, taking
Here we go.
the principle of islandit, you
Yeah.
don't know if it's the man or the woman in the relationship that's the island.
Let's say you do. The assumption of islandness is that you do. Islandness in the Gemara, I don't want to get into this right now, has very specific simanim. Like, it's not just, they lived together and there were no children. The islandness has
The
physical.
man doesn't have sperm, for example.
What?
It wouldn't be her fault. They could be
No,
living.
no. That's you're
years.
totally that's saris. Saris is if it's his fault, but not fault. But if the problem in having a child is his, that's a problem of saris. Islandess is somebody who has specific physical characteristics which establish her inability to become fertile, to have a child. That's factually what an islandess means. Yeah. Okay. Then the Gemara describes what those conditions are. One other example I wanted to bring before we move on, and that is we mentioned Maimar before. What is Maimar? Maimar is if you have Zika of Yibum. What does Zika mean? Again, the couple is married. There's no children. The husband has no children. He dies, right? So now she is Zikuka Liyibum. Let's say there are two brothers. Let's say Abraham died and he left two brothers, Reuven and Shimon. So what's supposed to happen, according to the Torah, is that one of them is supposed to Yibum. And if not Yibum, then Chalitza. Let's say instead of doing Yibum, Reuven or Shimon, it doesn't matter which one, gave her Kesef Kiddushin. Gave her a ring and said, Hareat Mekudeshesli. It's called Maimar. The effort to seal the Yibum, to seal this relationship, not through Yibum itself, but through Kesef or Shtar, that's called Kiddushay Maimar. Mem Aleph Mem.
And is it okay? Is it okay if he does it without Eidim?
So let's assume you need Eidim like you would for Kiddushin. That's a good question. It's a question in general, which we still have to discuss, whether Yibum and Chalitza or Yibum or Chalitza require Eidim. That's a big argument.
The only experience that I went through, there were Eidim, I remember.
Yeah, we certainly require Eidim, but whether lahalacha, if you did it without Eidim, and what about Yibum, what about Chalitza, that's a discussion. But the Maimar certainly would require Eidim. Now, Beis Hill is of the opinion, with one exception in Tosas on Nun Aleph on the base, quotes a view that says that maybe even Beis Hillel thinks that Maimar works as a partial kinyan. But the majority, we'll leave that for the moment. The preponderant view is that Maimar, according to Beis Hillel, is only a din d'Rabbanan. It has rabbinic status, but not biblical status. Now, it's from a Din Torah point of view, her status hasn't changed. If there's Reuven and Shimon, and they're both candidates to the Yibum, the fact that Reuven gave her Kesef Kiddushin, a Maimar, Minat Torah doesn't change anything. However, Beis Shammai disagrees. Beis Shammai is of the opinion that Maimar creates a kinyan for a Yivama. Minat Torah. The question is, does it fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum, or it just creates a kinyan Yibum? So the Ramban, this is the last line in our Mar Makomos. The Ramban in Yevamos, Chav Tes Amud Beis, says the following: Od lefi daiti, he says, according to my opinion, afilu leBeis Shammai, even according to Beis Shammai, kiyum mitzvah de Yibum leisa ela bebia. The Afagav, the Kani, the Maimar. Ramban says, even though the kinyan of Yibum, Minat Torah, according to Beit Shammai, is completed by Maimar, the mitzvah of Yibum will not be fulfilled until there's a physical aspect to the relationship. So the point is, this is the Ramban, this is the quintessential Ramban. Meaning, for Bali Tosfos, if you're not fulfilling the mitzvah, then you're involved in Eshasach. And there's no kinyan either. The only exception for Tosfos is maybe Me'uberes and Katan. That's what we discussed last week. That, when Tosfos talks about the status of a Me'uberes, of a pregnant woman, Tosfos was bothered by this question. That's what we saw last week on Lamed Hamid Base. Well, what happens if, she's pregnant, right? And he does yibum while she is pregnant, right? And then it turns out that the child is not viable. So she needed yibum. So the Reish Lakish, this is a machlokas Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and Reish Lakish says that you have to do the yibum again, because yibum in the context of Meuberes lo shma yibum. So but it also seems like he doesn't have to bring a korban. It's not like it was an illicit relationship either. So the Ramban says, yeah, because you can have something in between the mitzvah and where there's still no Eshesach. That's because it's Hutra. But according to Bali Tosfos, it's a big, big problem. So here too, this is the Ramban, the Shitaso. The Bali Tosfos would be very uncomfortable saying that for Beis Shammai, Maimer's a kinyan, but there's no mitzvah. Because if there's no mitzvah, then what happened to Isser? It's dechuya. It's only dechuya by the mitzvah. Mitzvah says sheyesh bakare. Mitzvah says is effective even in yesh bakares when it comes to ibum. But if there's no asay, it's only a kinyan, then there should be a problem. But the Ramban doesn't care. The Ramban, like the Rambam, like the Ramah, the Ramban sometimes uses the language harach minei. That's interesting. Just linguistically, the Bali Tosfos and the Duduchuya people speak about the Iser de Revia ale or the Iser de Rachav ale, Eshesach. Like Eshesach is hanging, waiting to fall on you, And the Ramban usually says, it kvar parach the Allah. As soon as he dies and doesn't leave children, there's no longer Eshesach. Even before the mitzvah of Yibum, even before the kinyan. So for the Ramban, the idea there could be a kinyan, without there being a mitzvah, is no big deal. So that's what he says. Just because Beis Shammai says it's a kinyan doesn't mean that Beis Shammai thinks it's a mitzvah, right? Okay, good. So now we're going to stop here, but we have another couple of minutes, so let's introduce next week, and then we'll send up Mar Makomos. So just as background, look at the Mishnah on Mem Tes Amud Aleph for a minute.
1 second, please. Mem Tes Amud Aleph.
Where are we looking?
On the Mishnah Mem Tes Amud Aleph, 49a. And I'll send these out for next week, hopefully. Okay, we want to talk a little bit about the position of Rabbi Akiva. What is the position of Rabbi Akiva? So let me give you a little background, and then we'll read two Mishnayos to get Rabbi Akiva. And there's a debate between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. What creates mamzerus, right? Or what are the circumstances that obstruct tfisas kiddushin? So the Chachamim and we paskin like the Chachamim, are generally the opinion that when you have an illicit relationship, meaning a relationship which would be punished by the death penalty, by kares, even if it's bidei shamayim, even if it's not in the courts, but it's, in the eyes of the Rabbanu Shalom, misa bidei shamayim. So anything that is chayiv kares, there's no tfisas kiddushin. So, for example, if you're to try to marry your sister, or your wife's sister, or your daughter, or your mother-in-law. The arayos, sheyesh bakaris and Parshas Achremos, pretty much. Another Eishes Ish. Let's say you had a ceremony, you were Mekadesh, It's not chal because it's not a
It's not profit.
viable. It's not
It
a
doesn't-
viable relationship.
Yeah,
The
it's
fact
not-
that there's chi of kares, either causes or attests to the illicit nature of the relationship, and therefore there's no tfisas kedushin. And any child that is born, of a relationship between two parties in which there is no tfisas kedushin or in which there is kares or more, is a mamzer. That child is, has the, the scepter of mamzerus. So where does this come from? There's a Mishnah on Daf Mem Tes Amud Aleph, which we're going to read in just one second. Rabbi Akiva disagrees. Rabbi Akiva has much lower, I should say, much lower standards for Tfisas Kedushin and Mamzerus. There are two versions of Rabbi Akiva. One is that Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that pretty much all chayve lavin, that whenever you violate a lav sheish b'malchus, pretty much, in matters of ishus, then there's no tfisas kedushin and there's mamzerus if there was a relationship. The other version of Rabbi Akiva is that it's limited to certain kinds of chayve lavin, what we call chayve lavin shel she'er, where it's a kurva issue in particular. Okay. Either way, that's the Mishnah on Mem Tes Amud Aleph. The Mishnah says, Ezehu mamzer, if you have it on Mem Tes Amud Aleph. What is a mamzer? Meaning a child, that whose halachic status is compromised. Kol she'er basar, right? Shehu below yavo, divrei Rabbi Akiva. Anytime there's a relationship between relatives, right, which is prohibited by a lav, by a losase, that kind of a relationship produces a child. That child is a mamzer. Shimon HaTeimani Omer Kol Shechayavin Olav Kares Bidei Shamayim. No, not Chayve Lavin, but a much higher standard, right? A more severe breach of halachic etiquette, and that is Kol Shechayavin Kares Bidei Shamayim. The halacha kidavarav, and we paskin like the Shimon HaTeimani. That's the view of the Chacham. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, what's that?
I'm sorry. Does he get it from a posuk, Shimon HaTeimani?
Yeah. They darshim psukim.
Okay.
In the Gemara, they darshim psukim.
Okay.
If you want to look right away, at the beginning of the Gemara says, "My Talmud Rabbi Akiva." What's the reasoning of Rabbi Akiva? Dichsiv lo yikach ish es eshes aviv. Right?
Lo yigale knaf aviv.
Lo yigale knaf aviv. Knaf shara aviv lo yigale. The Savala Rabbi Yehuda de Amar, it's banusas aviv akasav medaber. The Havala chaybe lavin. Let's say not his father's wife, meaning his stepmother, but let's say somebody that his father had just a relationship with, a nusas aviv, and that's only chayve lavin. The samach le lo yava mamzer b'kal Hashem. Alma mehani have mamzer. So that's the source for Rabbi Akiva that mamzerus is even b'chayve lavin. L'Rab Simoi demar b'shar chayve lavin, right? The lav d'she'er, even if it's not relatives, and so the Gemara goes on. L'Rab Yeshevev demar b'afilu chayve da'aseh. Inafkale mi velo b'shimon HaTeimani savala karabanan da'amri b'shomeres yavam shel aviv akasav medaber da'havala chayve krisus. Actually, this is not talking about anusas aviv. It's talking about shomeres yavam shel aviv, and that's chayve krisus. V'samach leila yavam mamzer alma b'chayve krisus hava mamzer. Okay, so basically, this is the source that there's a major argument whether or not chayve krisus, chayve lavin, only chayve lavin shel she'er, which of these levels of impropriety determined for tfisas kedushin and for mamzerus. Similarly, if you look at the Mishnah on Mem Dalid Amud Aleph, we have this again earlier. Should say again, should be earlier. The Mishnah says, Hamachsir Grusha. Everybody have Mem Dalet Amud Aleph?
1 second. Yes, I have it.
Mem Dalet Amud Aleph. Savrab, the Mishnah says, Hamachsir
Machsir
Grushaso. What?
Yes, yes.
Hamachsir Grushaso. So Machsir Grushaso means that he divorces his wife. She marries someone else in the interim, and then he marries her again. Then she gets divorced from the second fellow, and the first fellow takes it to what we discussed it last year because it's so prominent in the Parsha of Gittin. You know, what we call the Richard Burton. What was her name? Elizabeth Taylor syndrome. Like they married each other 5 times or something, right? You have to have a scorecard to keep up, you know, whether they were married or divorced. They married again, divorced again. So Hamatsu Grushaso, Vahanose Chalutzaso, or let's say they had a Yibum situation and he gave her Chalitza. And after the Chalitza, he decided he wanted to marry her, which is Asur, but it's only Balav. It says Asher lo yivneh, Misha lo bana, Shuv lo yivneh. That's what we discussed with the Gemara Daf Yud base. Vanose krovas palutzaso. In all these cases, the Mishnah says Yotzi, right? He's not allowed to marry her. Vahavlad mamzer, but that's all Divrei Rabbi Akiva. These are chayve lavin, and Rabbi Akiva holds that whenever there is a child produced in a relationship of chayve lavin, there's no tfisas kiddushin, and any child that that emerges is a mamzer. The chachamim omrim ein avlad mamzer, because the chachamim, right, do not agree that chayve lavin is the standard for tfisas kiddushin and for mamzerus. Umodim no say krovas grushaso shavlad mamzer. Okay. So the Bali Tosfos on Tes Amud Aleph asks the following question. Now look to Tes Amud Aleph just for a minute, and with this we'll stop. Look at the bottom Tosfos on Tes Amud Aleph.
1 second.
So we have everybody using their Gemaras today.
I use the Gemara, yeah. Tes Amud Aleph, okay.
Tes Amud Aleph. Look at the bottom Tosfos. Tosfos says it's Bahare Isur Mitzvah v'Isur Kedusha to Pligi Rabbi Akiva v'Rabbana. Right? So Tosfos says the following: B'chol dochti, in all the places, B'kol ha'mekomot, in Shas, meaning Pshita leila hashas, the Gemara takes as for granted the Chayve Lavin li Rabbi Akiva, that Chayve Lavin, according to Rabbi Akiva, the Amar ein Kedushin Tofsa b'Chayve Lavin, that not only is Kedusha not Tofes and children are Mamzerim, but also they're La B'nei Yibum v'Chalitza, for the same reason. So La B'nei Chalitza v'Yibum Ninu. Kemo, just like for the Chachamim, Chayve Krisus, Hacha. Ubaha'arel, Gabe Psuadako, Krus Shavcha, Perak Dal Misos. So Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that not only is there no Tvisas Kedushin and there's Mamzerus from Chayve Lavin, but if there's Chayve Lavin, there's no Chalitza and there's no Yibum. Says Tosfos, this is like a blockbuster question. Tos, the Tema, Lari, Amai lo amrina nami the Rabbi Akiva, the Leisi Aseh, Velid Chilos Aseh. Don't we have a rule, Aseh do Chilos Aseh?
Do?
So would Rabbi Akiva say there's no Yibum and there's no Chalitza? It's not it's not Lav Sheish Bakares.
But according to Rabbi Akiva, there's no difference in Lav Yesh B'Koros and not.
So this is a case that tests two things. On the one hand, there should be a Dechuya Heter because of Rabbi Akiva agrees in the general rule that Aseh is Dochalos Aseh. So you should be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum.
But he doesn't.
Even in a situation which would theoretically, what?
Is a factor. He doesn't seem to hold that Kores is the factor of that changes Aseh Los Aseh.
Maybe, but does it change?
Even a lav would create the same problems for him.
Well, but then he should be against the general principle of Aseh Dochalos Aseh.
Except
But
when it's shared.
Yeah, but that's not doesn't seem to be the case, in the Gemaras of Ase Dokalos Ase. No one gives that
According to
answer.
Rabbi Akiva, if there's he substitutes, I guess, the Kore's
No, no,
issue.
no.
Provus. In other
Your
words,
logic is very good, and the suggestion is very good. The problem is it goes against the evidence. We have no evidence that Rabbi Akiva doesn't believe in Ase Dokalos Ase in general.
no, he believes in Ase Dokalos, but the problem have Ase Dokalos Sheish B'Koretz. Okay,
But
what
there's no
happened?
Korah. There's no Korah.
But with him, he applies the same principles in this
Right.
case.
So, but right. So what
you
you
would
have to
substitute the Krovus, the relationship issue, as being instead of Koretz.
So what you might have to just adjust what you're saying a little bit. And this is what the Ramban and the Tosar Rosh says we'll see next time, and then we'll discuss it more and see other examples of this. The Ramban and the Tosar Rosh say, listen, it's true that there's Ase Dokalos Ase, but there's also, according to Rabbi Akiva's standard, erva. So this is like a trick question, On the one hand, you have what should be a dechuya kind of a heter, that the mitzvah should work because Asi Ase V'Dokalos Ase, something that Rabbi Akiva also believes in. At the same time, the impediment isn't just, there's an Isser. Okay, it's an Isser, so Asi Ase Dokalos Ase. It's a shame, erva. Maybe that just doesn't make possible Yibum or Kedushas Isha Shel Yibum at all. So that's what I want to discuss next time. If you remember, there was a debate between the Rambam and the simple reading of the Gemara that we just read before as well, which is most Rishonim say you don't need a source to teach you that erva is excluded from Yibum because there's no way to include it because they not say dochalos.
But it is the erva that creates the fact that there's no Tofes Kedushin according to Rabbi Akiva. So it does fit.
Yeah, so we'll see this, but Tosas doesn't give the answer. I think Tosas L'Shitasam doesn't give the answer, and the Ramban does give the answer because he has a whole different perspective on why it is that the ervas are excluded from Yibum. So that's what I want to pick up next time. And then I also want to talk about some other cases, Nida, Eshasish, Sota, Matsu Grishaso. So in the next few weeks, we'll talk about these other cases.
Good night.
Next week, we're on regular shear, and you wanted to have a Purim shear the week after, right, Jacob?
Yes. The next week regular and the week after Purim.
Okay,
And then we'll
great.
do in person Pesach. Thank you so much.
Have a great week, everybody.
Okay, have a good night, everybody.